Charles thought he had it all: wealth, power, and respect. In the city of Port Harcourt, his name was enough to open doors, enough to command admiration, and enough to silence men older than him. He had the cars, the suits, the lifestyle, and the money that made people call him the king of doings. But the day he tried to disgrace his ex-girlfriend at his own wedding was the day his pride was crushed forever. On that day, the guests were already gathered, the music loud, the drinks flowing. Everyone's attention was fixed on him, the young man who believed nothing could ever humble him. Then, just as he was enjoying the glory of the moment, a brand new Rolls-Royce pulled up at the entrance. Conversations stopped. Heads turned. And in one breath, the entire wedding forgot about Charles, for the woman stepping out of that car was none other than the girl he had mocked, insulted, and abandoned. Calista. But she was not the broken girl he expected to see. No, she was radiant, graceful, and more beautiful than ever. She stepped out in style, her smile brighter than the morning sun, and beside her were her triplets, with a man whose presence alone commanded respect. Charles's laughter died in his throat. His pride shrank like a flame in the rain. The disgrace he planned for her had turned back on him, and every eye in the hall saw it clearly. But to understand this moment, to truly see how it all unfolded, let us go back to where it all began. Charles was a young man in his early 30s, a man who had risen quickly in the world of money. He was a crypto trader, and his success in that unpredictable market made him wealthy beyond what many could imagine. In Port Harcourt, his name carried weight. He drove the latest luxury cars, wore expensive suits tailored to his frame, and attended special events where he was treated like royalty. Wherever Charles went, people bowed, people greeted him with respect, people whispered his name with admiration. They called him Odogwu. They called him Sir Charles. They called him the King of Doings. And Charles loved it. He loved the way heads turned when he entered a room, the way people rushed to open doors for him, the way women dreamed of being with him simply because of his wealth. He wore his ego like a crown and fed it every day with the praises of men. But beyond the grandeur, beyond the expensive lifestyle, Charles was a proud man. He loved to protect his image. He loved to show that he was better than everyone else. And in his mind, there was nothing and no one who could humble him. Now, in the middle of this glittering life stood Calista, a young woman in her late 20s, dark-skinned, but with a shine that made her beauty unique. Her smile was gentle, her demeanor calm, and her heart was filled with kindness. She had been with Charles for 5 years. People often said Charles was lucky to have her, that she was the type of woman any man would pray for. But Charles never saw her that way. In his eyes, Calista added nothing to his life. He was already wealthy, he already had the world at his feet, and he saw her as someone ordinary, someone who should be grateful that he even gave her attention. He would tell himself that he was doing her a favor by dating her, that he was lifting her up by considering her as a wife-to-be. He failed to see the treasure she was, the rare gem that could not be bought with money. Charles was harsh with his words, and he often reminded Calista that she was not good enough for his class. He would mock her simplicity, saying she didn't dress like the kind of woman who belonged to him. Sometimes, his anger spilled beyond words, and Calista bore the pain in silence. Yet, in all this, she loved him deeply. She did not love him for the money or the status. She loved him for the man she believed he could become if only he changed his ways. She looked past his arrogance, past his pride, and saw a young man who, if guided right, could do great things for society. She forgave him time and time again, even when her heart was bruised, even when her dignity was stepped on. And so the story of their relationship went on. Charles, proud and dismissive, and Calista, patient and loving. But as the elders say, when pride goes before a man, shame waits for him at the door. Their love, if one could still call it that, became a battlefield of words and emotions. Charles carried himself like a man who could never be questioned, and Calista carried herself like a woman who wanted peace at all costs. Whenever they quarreled, Charles would storm out, leaving behind a trail of harsh words. He would not look back, he would not soften his tone, and he never took the first step to reconcile. It was always Calista. Always her, swallowing her pride, reaching out, begging for their relationship to hold together. She would be the one to call, the one to visit, the one to kneel before him with tears in her eyes, not because of his money, but because of love. She saw him as the man she wanted to spend her life with. And so, she forgave him each time. But Charles, instead of appreciating her patience, took her efforts as weakness. He would laugh with his friends, boasting, "That girl cannot leave me. No matter what I do, she will always come back. She knows I am her only hope. Without me, she is nothing." His words were sharp, his ego blind. Calista heard some of these things from people who cared about her, but she did not allow their warnings to harden her heart. She told herself, "One day he will change. One day he will see my love for him." But the days turned into months, and the months into years, and Charles only grew worse. There were nights when Calista cried herself to sleep, asking God why the man she loved could not see her worth. There were mornings when she forced a smile to cover the pain, just to keep the relationship alive. Yet deep inside, a small voice was already whispering, "Love alone is not enough. A man who refuses to value you does not deserve you." And then came the quarrel that changed everything. A disagreement like many others, but this one cut deeper. Charles insulted her in ways she had never imagined. His words pierced her soul, and this time, when he stormed out of the house, something broke inside Calista. For the first time, she did not call him. She did not beg. She did not swallow her pain to make peace. Days passed, and Charles waited. Weeks passed, and Charles expected her to return with her usual apologies. But Calista was silent. Her silence spoke louder than anything she had ever said. And in that silence, Charles laughed again, convinced that she would eventually crawl back. He told himself, "Where will she go? Who will accept her? Who can give her what I give her?" But pride is a liar, and soon Charles would learn that truth does not bend for any man. For while he waited, while he mocked, Calista was stepping into a new chapter of her life, one that would rewrite her destiny forever. Charles was used to winning. In his mind, every argument ended when he said so, and every mistake was forgiven only when he allowed it. He thought of Calista not as a partner in love, but as a follower, someone who could never survive without him. So when she stayed away longer than usual, he smiled and boasted to his friends. "Leave her," he told them. "She will come back. She always does. Women like her cannot live without a man like me." His friends laughed with him, but some shook their heads quietly. They knew Calista, and they knew her patience had limits. But Charles was too blinded by pride to see the warning signs. Calista, on the other hand, was done. The last quarrel had opened her eyes. 4 years, she had held on, believing in love, hoping that Charles would change, praying that the man she saw in her dreams would one day appear in real life. But the man she loved was not willing to change. He was not willing to see her value. He was not willing to treat her as a woman worthy of respect. So, she walked away. She did not announce it. She did not cry out loud. She did not throw accusations. She simply chose peace. For the first time in years, she told herself, "I deserve better. I deserve love that does not break me. I deserve to be seen, not used." Charles waited, but the days turned into weeks, and still, no word from Calista. He grew angry, then restless, then dismissive again. He convinced himself she was suffering, that she was somewhere in regret, that she would soon crawl back to him in shame. But Calista was not in shame. She was in freedom. She began to heal. She began to breathe again. She began to smile without fear of being mocked. And slowly, life began to reward her courage. The elders say, when one door closes, another opens. But sometimes the new door is not just better, it is far beyond what you imagined. And that was the gift Calista was about to receive. Because while Charles mocked her silence, someone else saw her value. Someone else saw the jewel that Charles had thrown aside. And when that man came into her life, everything changed. Life has a way of rewarding those who endure pain with patience. For years, Calista had carried the burden of an unbalanced love, but once she let go, the world seemed to open up before her. She focused on herself, on healing, on rediscovering the joy she once had before Charles. Her smile returned, and this time, it was real. Her steps grew lighter, and her heart stronger. It was in this season of rediscovery that she met someone new. A man whose wealth surpassed Charles's, but more importantly, a man whose heart was rich with kindness. He was a businessman, respected across the country, known not only for his success but for his humility. Where Charles carried himself like a king demanding worship, this man carried himself like a servant who wanted to give. He noticed Calista, not because of her beauty alone, but because of the calmness that surrounded her. He saw in her a woman of dignity, a woman who had depth, a woman who could bring peace to a home. He pursued her, not with pride, but with patience. He listened to her, valued her opinions, and respected her boundaries. And for the first time in her life, Calista felt what it meant to be truly cherished. Their relationship blossomed quickly, built on mutual respect, laughter, and genuine love. In less than a year, he asked for her hand in marriage. Unlike Charles, he did not act as though he was doing her a favor. Instead, he spoke with honor, saying, "I will count it as the greatest blessing of my life if you agree to be my wife." The wedding was grand, yet elegant, nothing forced, nothing done for empty show. Family and friends gathered, not because of his money alone, but because they truly celebrated their union. Calista walked down the aisle that day, not as a woman begging for love, but as a woman receiving the love she deserved. A year later, her joy doubled, no, tripled. She became a mother, and not just to one child, but to triplets. 3 beautiful children who filled her home with laughter and her life with meaning. She was radiant, she was fulfilled, and she was surrounded by love that Charles could never have given her. While Charles imagined her suffering, Calista was flourishing. While Charles thought she would regret leaving him, she was living a life far beyond his imagination. The same woman he mocked as ordinary had become extraordinary, and her life was proof that destiny cannot be stopped by pride. The elders say, the stone that the builder rejects often becomes the cornerstone. And Calista, once rejected, had become a shining example of what patience and faith can bring. Time moved on, and Charles also decided to settle down. He had found another woman, one who admired his wealth and enjoyed his lifestyle. To him, that was enough. Love was not his concern, status was. He wanted a wedding that would shake the city of Port Harcourt, a wedding that would make the newspapers, a wedding that would prove once again that he was still the king of doings. Preparations were loud and extravagant. The venue was decorated with luxury, cars lined the streets, and guests gathered in their finest clothes. Charles wore a smile that day, not only because he was marrying but because he had something else in mind. He had sent an invitation to Calista. Deep in his heart, he wanted her to come. Not out of kindness, not out of goodwill, but out of pride. He wanted her to see what she had lost. He wanted her to walk in looking sad, lonely, and broken. He wanted the crowd to whisper, "That is the woman who once dated Charles. Look at her now. See how he has risen without her." In his mind, the wedding was not only about joining his bride, but also about humiliating his past. As the music played and the hall buzzed with excitement, Charles stood tall, shaking hands, receiving praises. People hailed him, just as always. His friends slapped his back, saying, "Today, you have outdone yourself." And Charles laughed, drinking it all in. But pride has a way of setting traps for the man who carries it. The elders say, When a man digs a pit for another, he must be careful not to fall into it himself. And as Charles waited with secret delight for Calista to appear in shame, destiny was arranging something very different. For that day, Calista was not coming as the broken ex-girlfriend he imagined. She was coming as a woman transformed, a wife, a mother, a queen in her own right. She was coming with a presence that would silence every laugh, every mockery, every proud word Charles had ever spoken. And soon, as the celebration reached its peak, Charles's eyes would be open to a truth he had long ignored, that no man is greater than destiny, and no heart can be mocked without consequence. The hall was alive with noise, laughter, music, and the clinking of glasses. Charles stood tall in his designer suit, his face glowing with confidence. He felt untouchable, as though the day belonged only to him. But just outside the hall, destiny had parked itself in the form of a shining Rolls-Royce. The car was spotless, brand new, the very latest model of that year. As it rolled to a stop, heads began to turn. Guests at the entrance paused mid-conversation. Murmurs rose. Phones came out. Whispers spread like wind in dry grass. "Who is that?" someone asked. "See the car." "Who could it be?" another replied. Then, the door opened slowly, and out stepped Calista. She was radiant. Her beauty had matured with grace, her smile brighter than ever, her steps sure and confident. Her gown flowed with elegance, her jewelry subtle but commanding. This was not the timid young lady people once pitied at Charles's side. This was a woman who had found herself, who had been lifted, who carried herself like royalty. And she was not alone. Behind her stepped a man whose presence spoke of quiet power, the kind of power that does not need to shout to be noticed. And in their arms, laughter echoed, the laughter of children. Not one child, not two, but three. Triplets. Calista's triplets. The crowd gasped. Eyes widened. Voices trembled. "Is that not Calista? Wait. Those are her children. Look at her husband." All at once, the wedding that was supposed to glorify Charles became the stage for Calista's triumph. Guests whispered among themselves, forgetting the groom, forgetting the ceremony. All eyes followed her as she walked in, her husband by her side, her children completing the picture of a life fulfilled. Charles saw her, and his heart sank. The smile that had carried him all morning vanished. His confidence melted like ice under the sun. He could not believe his eyes. The woman he thought would crawl back to him in shame had arrived in glory. The woman he had mocked as ordinary had come in grand style, with a life brighter than his own. It was as though heaven itself had chosen that moment to remind Charles that pride always leads to downfall. He had invited her to disgrace her, but instead, he was the one disgraced. And no one needed to speak it out loud, everyone in that hall could see it. Charles stood frozen. His bride tugged at his arm, whispering his name, but his ears were deaf to her voice. His eyes remained glued to Calista, to the husband who stood tall beside her, to the children whose laughter filled the hall like music. For the first time, Charles understood what true success looked like. It wasn't in the expensive suits or the gold chains he wore. It wasn't in the cars parked outside in his name. It wasn't in the cheers of guests who would eat his food today and gossip about him tomorrow. True success was peace. It was family. It was honor. And Calista had all three. The guests no longer hid their whispers. Some shook their heads in pity for Charles. Others smiled at Calista, nodding in admiration. What was meant to be her shame had become her shining hour. The ceremony continued, but the sparkle was gone. Charles moved through it like a man carrying a heavy weight on his shoulders. Every time his eyes strayed, he saw Calista, calm and content, her children playing by her feet, her husband's hand resting protectively on hers. By the end of the day, it was clear to everyone. Charles's wealth had bought him a wedding, but Calista's grace had earned her respect. And as the story goes, Charles learned too late that pride is a fragile crown. The man who believes others are beneath him often finds himself bowing before the very people he once mocked. So, my dear listener, remember this: never look down on anyone. Life has a way of turning tables when we least expect it. The stone you reject today may become the cornerstone tomorrow. And the person you laugh at in their struggle may be the very one you envy in their glory. Because in this life, it is not the loudest who win, but the humble who rise.